semester. It's my pleasure to welcome John Evans, the Tata Chancellor Chair in Social Sciences, Professor of Sociology, and Associate Dean of the Social Science, Co-Director of the Institute of Practical Ethics. You have too many titles.
I know.
At the University of California, San Diego. Most importantly, for my side of things, like a close collaborator working with us right now on the Tata Foundation grant. Maybe he will allude to that, but we have been known each other for quite a bit of time. Right? He has focused his research on a number of overlapping areas, all of which concern the foundational humanistic questions behind scientific and technological development. He's an expert of the ethics of human gene editing and more generally the ethics of science and technology. And I know he has overlapped with Professor Schofield here in consensus report for the National Academy of Science on the issue of human gene editing. He's an elected member of 3 honorary societies representing bioethicists, sociologists, and scholars on the relationship between religion and science. He may tell you about his more recent book that's here on the screen, but please join me in welcoming John.
Thank you very much, Dominique. You left off the most important part of that, which is Madison West class of 1984. I spent 2 years living in a dormitory here, which the name now eludes me, but it's down on the water, very old. Anyway, down there. So I'm Madisonian from long ago, and it's always great to be back, and it's always great to be back in life science communication, to have this diverse group of people exposed to my work, and I'd love to hear from what your thoughts are about this. So I'm going to be talking about this book, and everyone I sell, I make another 70 cents, and so buy now, buy early, buy many. I'm going to start by giving the prerequisite warning. I'm not a scientist. I rely upon scientists to tell me what's possible. I'm not a philosopher. I'm not a theologian. I'm a sociologist who has just enough knowledge of all these areas to be dangerous. Most of my research project involved discourse analysis of interviews, archival analysis, and quantitative analysis of survey. Today, I'm just going to really talk about the survey to make things quick. Here's what I'm talking about today, which seems like a lot. But believe it or not, I can do it in the amount of time here, because some of these go pretty fast. But more importantly, if you check out, when you see orange, that's where I am, if you check back in, okay? So what am I talking about today? I want to first talk about human brain organoids. A human brain organoid is a three-dimensional assemblage of human neural cells grown in the laboratory from stem cells. Imagine you take the skin, a bit of skin cells from Dominique's hand, you coax those cells into reverting to stem cells. The stem cells are the basic cells from which all other cells are created. Then you coax those into becoming a brain cell. What if you took the cells from someone who had genetically derived neurological disease? You would end up with an organoid that had the genetics of that disease. Scientists have done this with autism, schizophrenia, various neurological degeneration disorders. These things are currently very small, 4 to 5 millimeters in diameter. At present, there are limitations on these becoming like full versions of our brains. One major constraint is that organoids do not have blood vessels to supply oxygen and nutrients, so their size will be limited. More importantly, organoids are from only one part of your brain, and what you call your brain, okay, is a symphony of communication from various parts of your brain. And perhaps even more importantly, anything like consciousness requires interaction with the environment, and these things have no way to interact yet. However, they're getting more complex. Scientists are quickly working on the vascularization problem. It's anticipated that the organoids will be able to grow larger and more complex. It also turns out that when you put organoids from different parts of the brain next to each other, they form links between themselves, creating a network that is more like an actual full brain called an assembloid. There are also the slightest hints of interaction. It turns out that these organoids emit electrical signals like you would find if you connected it to like an EEG. One experiment found that they emit electrical signals sort of like human fetuses in utero. Another experiment attached to retinal cells, when you shine the light on the retinal cells, it creates electrical output in one of these. Another experiment attached the organoid to a spider-like robot, and they took the information emitted from the organoid to move the legs, although at this point it hasn't gone the other way around. It doesn't have any way of absorbing the information from the robot. So obviously this is not interaction the way that we're having interaction right now. This is the most rudimentary type of interaction. So that's an organoid. Let's turn to chimeras. A chimera is a non-human animal with human cells in it. The term chimera comes from ancient mythology, which is full of not only animal-to-animal chimeras like horses with wings, but human animals chimeras like this one. There are no centaurs at present, and the current reality is a lot less dramatic. There's a decades-long history of creating human-animal chimeras where the mix is not in the brain. For example, scientists have tried to create pigs with human-like internal organs that could be transplanted to humans. This here is a humanized mouse. It is a mouse with a human-like immune system used in medical research. So I'm not going to really talk about non-neural chimeras. I want to focus on a neurochimera, which is a non-human animal with human neural cells in it. So how could you possibly do that? Number one, you can take a human brain organoid and put it in like a mouse brain. So my campus has an entire lab of mice run around with human brain organoids in them. In some of the experiments, the mice got smarter by mouse standards, okay? Another experiment, it used to be just that the organoid was like, the mouse was like a vessel for the organoid. Now that they've done this a bunch of times, the human brain tissue is interacting with the mouse brain and is receiving the sensory information from the whiskers. It's anticipated that soon it'll be possible to use a technique that creates the mouse blastocyst. So it's like 200 cells that will grow into a fetus and into a mouse. You destroy the cells in the blastocyst that will become the mouse brain. You put in the human cells, and the mouse brain would be partly made of human cells. Now, needless to say, if you can do this with a mouse, you can probably do it with a monkey. And then, needless to say, humans and monkeys are not that far apart evolutionarily. So, you could also use genetic engineering to put human genes in the cells of a mouse brain. These distinctions in how you do this lack ethical relevance, really. So I'm not going to be talking about the different methods. And again, I want to be clear on these things here, right? So if you were to encounter a mouse with human brain components in it, it's not going to stand up and say, "Hi, I'm Mickey," right? And why is that? First, mice do not have speech. Number two, compare the size of a mouse skull and a human skull. Now, obviously, the size of the skull is not perfectly determined, but there is a correlation. Third, a mouse, most importantly, a mouse goes from a blastocyst to an actual mouse in 25 days, whereas a human is 9 months. What you would actually have, what would it be like if you had a human gestate for 25 days? The answer is no one has any idea, okay? However, there's heightened concern about this once you start doing with primates. Primates are a lot more similar to human in every way. Their skulls are bigger, their brains are bigger, their gestation period is more like humans, etc. Such research is currently underway in China. So why do this? Why would people create these? And the reason is that these are called, both of these, the organoids and these animals, are called human brain substitutes. The ethical reason is that you need to conduct medical research to alleviate human suffering caused by neurological diseases and disorders. Yet, you can't experiment on actual live brains inside of people's skulls. And so these are substitutes. A scientist recently told me it's a great time to be a mouse with Alzheimer's disease. What does that mean? There's all sorts of treatments that work really well in mice, and then they take them into humans and they don't work. Okay? Because it turns out, I guess should be obvious to us, whereas a mouse liver or whatever is fairly like a human, humans are quite different than mice up here, right? And so it isn't the same. And so they want to test drugs for Alzheimer's, et cetera, in human brains. Summary is what I said right there. So what is the ethical concern with this? Let me just put a bunch to the side for now. Before I get to these sort of what I consider to be the big ethical questions. These are more narrow ones. Number one, are you opposed to medical experimentation on animals? If so, you would have gotten off this train long ago. Okay? Number two, what level of consent is required to grow an organoid from someone's abandoned tissues? Some stem cell lines that are growing away in labs have unknown origin. Do we recontact those people and say, do you mind if we grow an organoid from your cells? Thirdly, if you create a mouse that is so smart that it's as smart as a pig, should we treat that mouse more like we treat pigs? Different animals are given different treatments in medical experiment contexts, all the way up to some sorts of non-human primates who essentially there's more or less a ban on doing research on. And finally, what are the evidentiary standards for societal safety? These are all really important. I'm going to put those aside for today. What I want to talk about is ethics. Whose ethics should determine what we actually do? I'm going to compare the opinion of professional ethicists with the public. And the reason for this is that, at least in the US, the ethicist views are what actually set policy. For example, the US government will consult with ethicists to decide whether it will fund neurochimeric animal research. Since the professionals have this dominant voice, they're a useful comparison to the public. I'm also playing with a tension in this bioethics discipline, the people who do this, which is that it claims authority to speak in this issue because it claims to represent the views of the public. One of the things I've done a number of times in my work is to show the extent to which that is and is not the case. So, what did I do? This is ultimately an empirical social science project. The rest of my talk, I'm going to compare the ethical concerns of the academic bioethics debate with that of the public. So, how do I determine what academics believe? Okay? Well, one way to do this is very easy. They write down everything they think and they publish it, and it's all on the internet, and then you can just download it, and there's your position right there. I mean, obviously there's other ways to do that, but that's what I did. How do you determine the public's concerns? Well, for this project, I first conducted 35 in-depth interviews with a stratified sample from the public. This testing was used to build a nationally representative social survey, which uses what's called an experimental vignette design, which I'll explain in a minute. With this design, I can make claims about what the US public thinks. And there are many details I'm going to skip here about how I did this. You can ask questions about it later on. When doing research in an area where there's not enough existing research and there's not extensive discussion in the public, there's not one survey question. I'm not going to come up with one definitive thing that's going to answer this question. Most of the research I'm interested in, it's suggestive, and you need a bunch of different research projects to really nail down what's going on. Those are the sorts of questions that I like. So what did I do? Let's start with the organoid. I use an experimental vignette approach that has a number of advantages when investigating these abstract ethical issues. The idea is to use randomization to avoid confounding factors. I suspect most people in this room have had statistics. This is like a clinical trial. For a COVID vaccine trial, we might worry that the vaccine works because of the racial background of the trial participant, their educational level, what they do for a living, or whatever. But we don't worry about that because we take all the participants and randomly assign them to the control arm or the treatment arm or the study. And if fewer people in the treatment arm get sick, well, then we can be confident that it worked due to the vaccine itself and not something about the participants. A vignette survey does the exact same logic. A vignette is a paragraph-long description in a survey where survey respondents are randomly assigned to see different chunks of text. At the end, the vignette, the respondent is typically asked, like, do you approve of this technology? So let me walk you through the organoid one. It started by saying a human brain organoid is a, okay, and half the people in the survey were randomly assigned to see a half-inch size, 5-inch size. I recognize there are no, if there's any organoid scientists in the room, there are no 5-inch wide organoids at present. I can tell you why I did that, and the costs, the pros and cons of what I did, if you'd like. Then there's a part here to make it, truly like an actual scenario. The question here is, do respondents who see it one way differ in their response than the others? So you can guess right now, if you saw a 5-inch sized organoid versus a half an inch, the people who see a 5-inch are going to be less approving of the technology because it's more sort of scary, right? But it gets more subtle than that. Okay, the key here, though, is that the respondents don't know that the other half of the people saw the other one. So they can't game their responses. They don't know what your hypothesis is, which isn't the case with many other survey questions I could ask. Now, a number of other features in the paragraph vary as well, which I'm going to sort of gloss over for now. But there are 64 possible randomly generated vignettes that a respondent could be assigned to see. So when I describe this to you, the part that's underlined is the part that changes. Okay, they don't see underlying, but that's what they saw. So half the respondents saw that one had been created, half saw that 10,000 were created. That was to get at various things of sort of like manufacturing human life, which is a long-time concern of mine. Half saw grown, half saw manufactured, again, to sort of generate these notions of manufacturing, instrumental rationality, and the like. And then what I'll be talking about today, half saw the debate was whether they would obtain self-awareness, half saw awareness of the surrounding. Those are different theories of consciousness. And in the book, I analyze all this, but I'm going to skip over that. Most critically was the level of consciousness. So in this example, they saw that it would obtain the consciousness level of an insect. Okay. So after the vignette, the respondent was first asked their agreement with the statement, research into human brain organoids should continue. Okay. All right. So what is the result, the most general result? So averaging across all the 64 possible things you would see, okay, this is what the opinion is, which is very much in agreement with this research. And this is because I portrayed the research with the real motivation, which is neurological research into people's Alzheimer's and everything else versus these other concerns. If I had skipped the part about research for human disease, it would be far into the disagree. So this is always a choice you have to make. Okay. So this isn't all we want to know. What we want to know is why the public reaches this conclusion and who approves and who doesn't approve, and again, and why. So I'll get back to that in a minute. Let me introduce the other one, which is the animal neurochimeric one. This is a different vignette, and so half the respondents saw I was creating a subspecies, and half saw a dozen. Again, this is a distinction that I've taken from debates about human gene editing. Is it worse to create an entire species? That would be like playing God, creating a new, interfering with nature, versus creating a bunch of them that are just going to die off is considered morally different. Half saw a monkey, half saw a mouse. And so you can all guess, the randomly assigned half the people who saw a monkey, are they more or less opposed to this technology? More, okay? Because people are more concerned about monkeys than mice for the following 57 reasons. Okay. There are 4 different versions of how the animal was changed, including one shown here about the tissue implant, which is, there was brain tissue from a human implanted in them, and so I'll skip that for a second. A third saw these were described as humanized mice or monkey, depending what they saw. Some saw the word chimeras, and some saw the word severe. Severe, just to preface this, is a term I made up, okay? And the reason I made it up is I wanted something that had absolutely no baggage on it as a comparison, okay? So right after this, I asked, do you strongly disagree, agree, et cetera, with the statement, I support the creation of these chimera, whatever I ended up calling them, okay? Again, the question is whether you get more agreement from respondents who are randomly assigned to see the different versions. And to give the obvious one, it is true that those who saw monkey were more opposed to those who saw mouse. If you average across all these possibilities, here's the basic result with neochimeras. This is a much more mixed picture of opinion, and you'll see why in a few minutes. So that's the basic technology. That's the most basic finding. Let's turn to the ethics of this and compare the ethics of the bioethicists and the ethics of the public about this. So let's start bioethicists. So the first media stories on these technologies quote bioethicists who state their concern that organoids and chimeras will become human. Now, no one in the debate thinks that an organoid or mouse could become a biological human, but the biological distinction doesn't matter for bioethicists. What it is, they could obtain the moral status of a human, otherwise known as personhood. Okay? They wouldn't be a human physically, they would be a human morally. This reflects the assumption in bioethics, which is a human is that which has certain capacities. There's long lists of these things, and they're debated, but like consciousness, foresight, intelligence, communication, etc. But the absolute bottom line capacity for personhood in bioethics and in philosophy, at least analytic philosophy, is consciousness. Okay? So this whole idea that humans are those which have certain capacities, you all recognize this logic. It's the logic in the Roe versus Wade abortion decision. You know, fetuses obtain capacities as they go. If you're familiar with this, have you ever signed an advance directive in a hospital? If I don't have these certain capacities, I do not want to be kept alive. You're familiar with this logic. So some animals like chimpanzees have a lot of these valued capacities, and thus the ethicists would say should be treated more like we treat humans. Okay? Therefore, an organoid or neurochimera would obtain the moral status of a human if it obtained key capacity of the human, most notably consciousness. So for example, in a news article about this, bioethicist Hank Greeley started that the question was, quote, whether you're creating something human-ish that you have to take seriously in terms of according it dignity and respect and figuring out what that even means. Another bioethicist talking about neurochimeric mice states that if we give them human cerebral organoids, what does that do to their intelligence, their level of consciousness, even their species identity? The article continues that the animals might become too human due to these human brain components. Greeley and his colleagues set the standard for whether you could transform a mouse into a man by whether it was a creature with some aspects of human consciousness or some distinctively human cognitive abilities. And finally, Chen and colleagues write that one of the primary concerns centers on the possibility that animals transplanted with human brain organoids will become more human. Their ethical concerns with organoids are due to being, quote, increasingly similar to the human brain, the source of higher order cognitive capacities that are most often equated with being human. So from the perspective of the bioethical debate that actually influences what happens with policy in this country, this is the primary, really the only question, okay, about consciousness. Finally, this is the charge given to a National Academy of Science Commission that I was a member of, where we're supposed to debate this. And this is a list of what we are supposed to debate. And you'll note that all the ones in red are essentially asking about consciousness. That was, you know, the only real question on the table. So this is the concern in the professional ethical debate, that either a neurochimeric animal or an organoid could obtain consciousness. So now you want to know, what is consciousness? And the answer is, I am not going to tell you, because this is, by my standards and my training, the largest morass in all of academic life. There's a debate with very little consensus. It's been going on for centuries. You could spend a career examining it. I have no qualifications to engage in it. Go get your philosophy and the PhD in the philosophy of mind. It's an interesting topic. But people in bioethical debate recognize that operationalizing consciousness into policy will be extremely difficult, not only due to a lack of an agreed upon definition, but how would you measure it? There's some very rudimentary things like the mirror test. Does an animal actually recognize itself in the mirror and stuff? But everyone agrees that that's very rudimentary. So this is what bioethicists believe is a moral problem. What about the public? I'm just going to tell you, in a previous study, I showed that the public uses a different definition of the human than do bioethicists. My present project here contains many analyses. I'm just going to use a few exemplars to get a sense of how I'm making these claims. So let's look at the survey. After the organoid vignette, I asked whether they approve of the research. I asked whether, after the research is done, the organoids could be destroyed, which is a good indicator of moral status. Okay? So in the bioethical arguments, more consciousness means more moral status. So the question is, did people who saw a vignette that different levels of consciousness have different answers to these questions? So 1/4 saw that an organoid could one day obtain the consciousness of an insect, 1/4 saw a pig, 1/4 saw human fetus. And again, we could talk about this decision. I was going to put human in, but I wanted to have a little bit of realism, that like some obviously little thing in a dish is not going to obtain human level consciousness. Anyway, this chart here is what are called predicted values. What % of those who saw no consciousness said they approve or strongly approve of organoid research? Okay, what % who saw consciousness of an insect, et cetera? And so, if you look at no consciousness, 69.5% of those who saw no consciousness approved or strongly approved of organoid research. And 54.6% said it was okay to destroy the organoids when done. That's the baseline. But then if we compare going down each column, if people were truly concerned with consciousness, greater consciousness would result in less willingness to destroy organoids, but it does not. To use the term of art, these differences are not statistically significant. So the same amount of people approve with different levels of consciousness. So it's critical that each respondent did not see any other description of consciousness. So people who saw insect did not know I'm asking about other people, about human fetus and so on. Okay, that's just a start there. Let's talk about neurochimeras. After the neurochimera vignette, I asked, we should treat these humanized, whatever, better than we treat other mice or monkeys. This gets at the moral status. Would people give the entity more moral status if it's described in various ways? So here is the difference, and the answer is basically there is no statistically significant difference between seeing the immune system versus the brain. So if consciousness were to matter, then we would see people thinking that animals with more human brain tissue should be treated better, but we don't actually see that. So let me turn to chimeras for a minute. The primary public concern is different for organoids and chimeras. When social scientists hear of a neurochimera, they don't think about consciousness. Knowledge of Western cultures would suggest that the public's main ethical concern is the foundational divide between humans and animals. Let me quickly explain. Societies have foundational cultural distinctions that are so deeply assumed that it's difficult for us to even see. These differ by society, mind, body, nature, culture, human object, and human animal. Okay. Here's a quote from Smits. You can read faster than I can talk. So, one way to recognize that you've found one of these distinctions is that when you cross it, it creates a response of fear, disgust, or fascination. Okay? Some people might think you lack these things. This is very common for highly educated people in Western society to think they don't acknowledge any of these distinctions. But anthropologists have shown that it's not just quote-unquote primitive societies that do this, but everyone does. They're just different for different societies. Popular culture plays with these distinctions because they work. Okay, they create fascination. So let's do just a quick examples. What is the thing on the left? It's a plastinate, an actual human body with a skin removed, encased in plastics. This is violating the inside-outside that most Western societies have. You guys probably think, oh, that's disgusting. And here's, of course, the other side. There's our friend, the zombie, violating the living-dead distinction. There's a reason why that's repeating in science fiction. And of course, Dr. Frankenstein's monster, also violating the living-dead distinction. Why did the villagers want to kill the monster? Because it was an abomination. It was an object of fascination, and the villagers wanted to kill it because it was violating this foundational distinction. So, this creates this, fear here. So everyone probably recognize the left. Does anyone of a certain age know who's on the right? This is happening. That's Mr. Ed, the talking horse. Okay, anyway, this is how bad television was in the early 1960s. That's Wilbur. The horse only talked to Wilbur. Anyway, so famous neurochimeras in American history. So finally, to sort of give you a sense of knowing that you and my respondents have these distinctions, what does this look like to you? So this is an artist's rendition of a humanized pig. And if it gave you kind of a little bit of a yuck response, it's because it is violating this distinction you may not know you even have, okay? And so the public has these divides, and they respond to them when they hear about things like mice with human brains. Okay. So, let me go a little faster here. Does this really exist for the public? So I couldn't do a whole survey of just vignettes, so I have some standard survey questions, one of which is, in general, humans are more similar to animals than they are different. So do you think of humans and animals as the same or distinct? Okay. This chart shows the percent of those who see human-animal divide, who approve of the research, and those who don't. So here, this is a very powerful dividing line. So those who agree with the divide, who really see this distinction, they don't approve this research at all, or lower amounts, and those who don't see a divide, they do. Same with the question about treatment. You also see this divide. So it seems like it's more about this divide than it is about consciousness. How about this? This was my little trick question here, which is, the theory is, if I name it humanized, you're reminding everyone that it's part human. If I use chimera or I use sea beer, you're not reminding people that this entity you just described is part human. So what do you have here? You see that you get the most approval when you use this fake term, sea beer, where you get the most disapproval is when you've called it humanized something. It reminds everyone that it's part human. Okay. So let me move on back to organoids. So in the scientific discourse, disembodied human parts have no moral status. If I were to cut the top of my finger off at the emergency room, they would throw it in the trash, okay? But medical sociologists and anthropologists see this differently, which is that the public does not view disembodied human parts as fully alienated from the original human. A good portion of the public thinks that a human retains a connection to their disembodied parts. So blood donors still think the blood was theirs after donation. And the strong version you often find is almost communicative. Many people think that if they receive blood, it has the personality or moral disposition of the person they got it from. Most famously are these anthropological studies of organ donation, where they find that, the species tissue specimen, which is people think that biospecimens are an extension of the self. Okay? The physical nature of the biospecimen retains an individual's essence. And the strongest version of this are these anthropological studies of organ donation. One classic study of this found that recipients seem to share the belief that some of the psychic and social and physical qualities of the donor are transferred with his or her organ into the person whom it's implanted. Okay. So, I will tell you that obviously on a scientific basis, this is ridiculous, okay? But the truth of the matter doesn't matter when it comes to public opinion on things having to do with policy, okay? And moreover, this is just an indicator, and I could go into this in great detail, the public are not materialists. The public are believe in various things that are not material reality. So, for example, a very large percentage of the public believe in souls, spirits, heaven, hell, etc. And so there's this general propensity to not just be purely materialist. Therefore, beliefs like this are much more plausible. So, an organoid is grown from skin cells of an existing human. It's disembodied human tissue. So from a scientific perspective, this is a 4-millimeter lump of tissue in a dish. But anthropologists would suggest that it's not. So after the organoid vignette, I asked the respondent to evaluate. Human brain organoids should be thought of as an extension of the person who donated the skin it used to make it. The public agrees with this more than they disagree with it. Okay? Even more strongly, if a human brain organoid could think, it might have the thoughts of the person who donated the skin cells. This is obviously outlandish and ridiculous, except what's important to know is not knowing anything about the technology, which is what no one in the public knows anything about this technology. This is the kind of thing that seems plausible to them, and it doesn't matter that is not scientifically accurate. So, all right, so let's go back to one more predicted values here, which is an organoid an extension of the donor? Okay, so people who believe that it is connected versus, and then back to the destroying, or we should treat it more like a human. So you look at that, that top one is a very large difference by survey standards, and the one below is a difference that's statistically significant, albeit much smaller. That is not an artifact for the stats hondos in the room. I checked it 57,000 times to make sure that it wasn't, but there's a huge difference there. So your belief in organoids being an extension of the human in some way determines your view of organoids. So I am going to skip my final little comment here. I have till 1 o'clock, right, Dominique? 1 o'clock. So I will just mention briefly that recently people have been attempting to link wired up human organoids together into creating a human biological electrical computer on the grounds that human brain uses less electricity than does a computer. And you would use this to create better AI. And I have an elaborate way of saying, and you can imagine how much I like sci-fi things here. Let's just say that if the public, my short version of this is, if the public is approving of organoid research because it's being weighed against with cures for Alzheimer's for your parents, if the weighing on the other side is to make a faster computer, you're not going to have any support for organoid research. That's my takeaway from that. So let me summarize. For academic bioethicists, the most important consideration for both of these technologies is whether either could obtain enough consciousness to warrant different treatment, or as extreme, be treated like a human. So if you had a chimpanzee with enough human characteristics like consciousness, then you would treat it like a human. My survey suggests that possible consciousness is not important for the public's views of these technologies. The public tends to adhere to a foundational distinction between humans and animals. Many of us have largely learned to not be concerned with, because you're all in grad school, but regular folks who are not learning these things still hold this divide. Finally, the public sees possible connections between disembodied human parts and actual humans. This connection gives a degree of reluctance to organoid research. Now, again, I want to reiterate, the public is also concerned about people suffering from neurological disease and support research that will reduce this suffering. Thus, we have an ethical dilemma. So as the research goes forward, I think what's really important is that we remember the public's reasons for being concerned about this research, because after all, it's the public that's paying the bill one way or the other for all of this research. So with that, I will stop and answer any questions you might have. Thank you. So you can turn that off.